The manila envelope slipped from Sarah Martinez's trembling hands as she stared at the impossible words typed on official letterhead. Before we jump back in, tell us where you are tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you are subscribed, because tomorrow I have saved something extra special for you. A ranch worth $12 million left to her by a man she had met exactly twice at charity events. But as the stranger's adult son stepped out of his black sedan with fury blazing in his eyes and lawyers trailing behind him, Sarah realized that some secrets come with a price that could destroy everything she thought she knew about family, justice, and the courage to do what is right. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Henderson and Associates, law firm, as Sarah Martinez pulled her aging Honda into a space between two gleaming luxury vehicles. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as she stared at the imposing glass building that housed one of Montana's most prestigious legal practices. The phone call 3 days earlier had been brief and mysterious. Thomas Henderson himself had requested her presence for the reading of a will, though Sarah could not imagine why anyone would name her in their final testament. At 28, Sarah worked as a social worker for the state of Montana, specializing in child welfare cases on the Blackfeet Reservation. Her days were spent navigating complex family situations, advocating for children caught between cultures, and fighting an endless battle against bureaucratic indifference. The salary barely covered her student loans and the modest apartment she rented in Browning, but the work gave her life meaning in ways that money never could. The receptionist's polished smile felt out of place as Sarah entered the marble-floored lobby. Everything about the law firm spoke of old money and established power, from the oil paintings of stern-faced men in expensive suits to the Persian rugs that probably cost more than Sarah earned in 6 months. She smoothed her best professional dress and tried to project confidence she did not feel. Thomas Henderson emerged from the elevator precisely at 10 o'clock, his silver hair perfectly styled and his navy suit tailored to perfection. He was perhaps 60 years old, with the kind of bearing that suggested he had never worried about paying bills or choosing between groceries and gasoline. His handshake was firm, his smile professional, and his eyes held secrets that made Sarah's stomach clench with unease. "Miss Martinez," he said, gesturing toward the elevator. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. I must admit, this is one of the most unusual situations I have encountered in 30 years of estate law." As they rode to the 10th floor, Sarah found herself studying Henderson's reflection in the polished steel doors. There was something in his expression that suggested the coming conversation would change everything, though she could not imagine how the death of someone she barely knew could possibly affect her quiet life among the reservation communities. The conference room overlooked the vast expanse of Montana ranch land that stretched toward the Rocky Mountains. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a view that spoke of endless possibility and the kind of wealth that shaped political decisions across 3 states. Henderson gestured to a leather chair at the head of a mahogany table that could have seated 20 people. "Miss Martinez," he began, settling into his own chair and opening a thick file folder. "What do you know about William Thornton?" Sarah searched her memory for any connection to the name. "William Thornton," she repeated slowly. "I think I met him at a few fundraising events for the reservation school programs. He seemed like a nice man, very interested in education initiatives. But I certainly would not say I knew him well." Henderson nodded as if this response confirmed something he had expected. "Mr. Thornton passed away 2 weeks ago from a sudden heart attack. He was 73 years old and one of the wealthiest ranchers in Montana. The Thornton family has owned the Double T Ranch for 4 generations, spanning over 50,000 acres of prime grazing land." The numbers meant nothing to Sarah beyond their obvious magnitude. 50,000 acres was larger than some small towns, representing wealth and influence she had never encountered outside of news stories about corporate mergers and political donations. I am sorry for his family's loss, Sarah said carefully, but I still do not understand why you asked me here. Henderson reached into his file and withdrew a sealed envelope bearing her name in careful handwriting. Because Miss Martinez, William Thornton has left you the entire Double T Ranch, along with all livestock, equipment, and financial assets. You are now worth approximately $12 million. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She gripped the arms of her leather chair as the room seemed to tilt sideways. $12 million was a sum beyond her comprehension, representing financial security that could last several lifetimes. But more than the money, the sheer impossibility of the situation made her question whether she was dreaming or perhaps suffering some kind of breakdown. "That cannot be right," she whispered. "There must be some mistake. I barely knew Mr. Thornton. We had maybe 3 conversations in my entire life." Henderson's expression grew grave as he slid the envelope across the polished table. "There is no mistake, Miss Martinez. Mr. Thornton was very specific about his intentions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. However, I should warn you that this inheritance comes with complications that you need to understand before you make any decisions about accepting it." Before Sarah could ask what kind of complications, the conference room door burst open with enough force to rattle the windows. A man in his early 40s strode into the room, his expensive suit failing to disguise the barely controlled rage that radiated from every line of his body. Behind him followed 2 other men in identical dark suits, their manner suggesting legal representation of the most aggressive variety. The newcomer was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of rugged handsomeness that spoke of outdoor work and physical confidence. His dark hair showed traces of premature silver, and his blue eyes burned with the fury of someone who believed he had been betrayed by the person he trusted most. This had to be William Thornton's son, and he was clearly not happy about his father's final decisions. Henderson rose slowly from his chair, his professional demeanor intact despite the dramatic interruption. "Mr. Thornton, I was not expecting you until this afternoon." The man fixed Sarah with a stare that could have melted steel. "James Thornton," he said without offering his hand. "And you must be the woman who somehow convinced my father to sign away 4 generations of family legacy." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implied accusation. "Mr. Thornton, I can assure you that I had no knowledge of your father's intentions. I am as surprised by this as you are." James laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Surprised? You expect me to believe that a social worker from the reservation just happened to inherit $12 million from a man she barely knew? That my father, who spent his entire life building this ranch, would give it away to a complete stranger?" One of the lawyers behind James stepped forward, placing a restraining hand on his client's arm. "Perhaps we should discuss this matter privately, Mr. Thornton. Making accusations without evidence could be problematic." Henderson maintained his calm professional tone despite the obvious tension in the room. "Mr. James Thornton, your father's will was properly executed and witnessed. Miss Martinez had no involvement in its creation and no prior knowledge of its contents." James turned his attention back to Sarah, and she saw something beyond anger in his eyes. There was pain there, the deep hurt of someone who felt abandoned by the person who should have loved him most. She recognized that expression from her work with displaced children, the look of someone whose world had been shattered by adult decisions beyond their understanding. "Miss Martinez," James said, his voice dropping to a more controlled register, "I do not know what hold you had over my father, but I can make you an offer right now. Walk away from this inheritance. Sign whatever papers Henderson has prepared, and I will give you $500,000 in cash. More money than you could earn in 10 years. The offer was staggering, representing financial security beyond anything Sarah had ever imagined. $500,000 could pay off her student loans, buy a house, and provide stability for the rest of her life. But something in James Thornton's desperation made her hesitate. Why was he so eager to resolve this quickly? What was he afraid she might discover if she actually took possession of the ranch? "Mr. Thornton," she said carefully, "I appreciate your offer, but I think I need to understand your father's reasoning before I make any decisions. Perhaps there is something in his personal effects or correspondence that would explain his motivations." James' expression darkened further. "There's nothing to understand. My father was a 73-year-old man who had been dealing with increasing isolation since my mother's death. He was vulnerable to manipulation, and someone clearly took advantage of that vulnerability." Henderson cleared his throat diplomatically. "Actually, Mr. Thornton, your father included a sealed letter explaining his decision. Miss Martinez, you will find it in the envelope along with the legal documents." Sarah broke the wax seal with trembling fingers and unfolded 2 sheets of expensive letterhead covered in William Thornton's careful handwriting. As she read, her confusion deepened into something approaching understanding, though the implications were more disturbing than anything she could have imagined. "Miss Martinez," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then Providence has finally given me the opportunity to correct a terrible injustice that has haunted my family for over 20 years. Your work with Native American children has not gone unnoticed, and your advocacy for families torn apart by bureaucratic indifference makes you the only person I trust with the truth about the Double T Ranch." Sarah looked up from the letter to find James watching her with obvious anxiety. Whatever his father had written, he clearly feared its contents. She continued reading, her heart rate increasing with each carefully crafted sentence. "In 1998, my late wife Eleanor and I discovered 7 Native American children living in deplorable conditions after their parents died in a car accident. The state system was overwhelmed, and these children faced separation and placement in institutions far from their cultural heritage. Eleanor convinced me that we could provide them with a better life on the ranch, away from the bureaucratic machinery that treats children like case numbers rather than human beings." The words hit Sarah like successive physical blows. 7 Native American children, hidden away on a private ranch, raised outside the official system that should have protected them. As a social worker, she knew the legal and ethical implications of such an arrangement. Private individuals could not simply adopt children without proper procedures, background checks, and court approval. What William Thornton was describing sounded like kidnapping, regardless of his good intentions. "We did not go through official channels because we knew the system would separate the siblings and place them in homes that had no understanding of their cultural needs. Eleanor and I raised these children as our own, providing them with education, love, and connection to their Blackfeet heritage through visits with tribal elders who understood our situation." James had gone pale as he watched Sarah read. Clearly, he knew about the children, which raised new questions about his complicity in the arrangement and his current desperation to prevent outside scrutiny of the ranch operations. "The children are now adults," the letter continued, "but they still live on the ranch and work the land that has become their home. They are successful, educated, and deeply connected to both their native heritage and the life we built together. However, I know that our arrangement was legally questionable, regardless of our good intentions." Sarah set down the letter, her mind reeling with the implications. 7 Native American children, now adults, living on a ranch they believed was their home. A wealthy family that had circumvented the legal system to create their own version of child welfare. A son who was fighting to inherit property that housed people whose very presence represented decades of legal violations. "Mr. Thornton," she said, looking directly at James, "are these children still living on the ranch?" James exchanged glances with his lawyers before answering. "They are adults now, and yes, they live and work on the property. My father provided them with excellent educations and opportunities they never would have received in the foster care system. And you knew about this arrangement all along." "I was 15 when it began." My parents made the decision without consulting me, but over the years, those 7 people became like siblings to me. The ranch is their home, Miss Martinez. It is the only home they have ever really known." Sarah understood now why William Thornton had chosen her as his heir. As a social worker specializing in Native American child welfare, she would understand the complex cultural and legal issues involved. She would also have the professional knowledge to navigate the bureaucratic challenges that would arise once the truth became public. Henderson spoke into the heavy silence that had settled over the conference room. "Miss Martinez, there's more to the letter. Perhaps you should finish reading before making any decisions." The second page contained William Thornton's final request, and it was more complex than anything Sarah could have anticipated. "I am leaving the ranch to you because I believe you will protect the family we created, while working to resolve the legal complications we avoided. The 7 adults have no official documentation of their existence for the past 25 years. They have no social security numbers, no birth certificates, no legal identity that would allow them to function in the outside world." Sarah felt sick as the full scope of the problem became clear. In trying to protect 7 children from an imperfect system, the Thorntons had created a situation that was potentially worse. These adults existed in a legal limbo that made them vulnerable to exploitation and denied them basic rights that other citizens took for granted. Your expertise in social services and your understanding of Native American community issues make you uniquely qualified to help them establish legal identities while protecting their connection to the land they consider home. I am trusting you to find a solution that honors both the letter of the law and the spirit of family that Eleanor and I tried to create." The letter was signed with a shaky hand, suggesting that William Thornton had been aware his time was limited when he wrote these final instructions. Below his signature was a postscript that made Sarah's chest tighten with emotion. "These 7 people are not possessions to be inherited, Miss Martinez. They are human beings who deserve the chance to choose their own futures. I pray that you will help them find a way to live in both worlds, the one we created and the one that exists beyond our gates." Sarah folded the letter carefully and looked around the conference room. James Thornton's lawyers were whispering urgently among themselves, clearly recognizing the legal minefield they were about to enter. Henderson maintained his professional composure, but she could see the concern in his eyes. This was not a simple matter of estate law. This was a situation that could involve federal authorities, immigration issues, and civil rights violations. "Mr. Thornton," Sarah said, addressing James directly, "I need to meet these people. I need to understand their situation before I can make any decisions about the inheritance or how to proceed." James stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Absolutely not. You are not going to come onto my family's property and disrupt the lives of people who have finally found stability and happiness." "They are not your family's property," Sarah replied with the firm voice she used when dealing with uncooperative bureaucrats. "According to your father's will, they are living on land that now belongs to me. More importantly, they are human beings who have the right to make their own choices about their futures." One of James's lawyers leaned forward. "Miss Martinez, we should inform you that we intend to contest this will. The circumstances surrounding its creation suggest undue influence and possible mental incapacity on the part of Mr. William Thornton." Henderson's response was swift and authoritative. "That is your right, of course. However, I should point out that Mr. Thornton was examined by 2 independent physicians within a month of his death. Both confirmed his mental competency. Additionally, he consulted with 3 separate legal opinions before finalizing his testament." Sarah stood, feeling the weight of $12 million and 7 human lives settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. "Gentlemen, I think we need to take a step back. This is not about money or property rights. This is about doing what is best for 7 people who have been living in legal limbo for most of their lives. She turned to James, seeing past his anger to the fear and confusion beneath. "Mr. Thornton, I understand that this situation is difficult for you. Your father has placed all of us in an impossible position. But these people deserve to have their voices heard in any decisions that affect their futures." James stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working as he struggled with emotions too complex to express in the formal setting of a law office. Finally, he nodded slowly. "One visit," he said. "You can come to the ranch and meet them. But I will be there, and I will not allow you to make promises you cannot keep or raise expectations that will only lead to disappointment." Sarah felt a surge of relief mixed with apprehension. She was about to enter a situation unlike anything in her professional experience. 7 adults who had been living off the grid for decades, a wealthy family with secrets that could destroy their reputation, and legal complications that could take years to resolve. Henderson handed her a business card and a set of keys. "The ranch is about an hour north of here. These keys will get you through the main gate. I suggest you take some time to review all the documentation before your visit." As the meeting dispersed, and James left with his lawyers, Sarah found herself alone with Henderson in the conference room, overlooking the Montana landscape. The lawyer's professional mask had slipped slightly, revealing genuine concern about the situation they were all about to navigate. "Miss Martinez," he said quietly, "I have to ask, are you prepared for what you might find out there? This is not just about money or property. You are about to become responsible for 7 people whose entire existence has been built on a foundation that could crumble if the wrong authorities get involved." Sarah thought about the children she worked with on the reservation, kids caught between worlds and struggling to find their place in systems that often failed to understand their needs. She thought about the bureaucratic battles she fought every day, trying to keep families together while navigating regulations that sometimes seemed designed to create obstacles rather than solutions. "Mr. Henderson," she said, gathering the legal documents and William Thornton's letter, "I became a social worker because I believe every person deserves the chance to make choices about their own life. These 7 people have been denied that chance for 25 years. Whatever else happens, they deserve to know the truth about their options." The drive north from the law office took Sarah through some of the most beautiful landscapes she had ever seen. Rolling hills covered with native grasses stretched towards snow-capped peaks that pierced a sky so blue it seemed artificial. This was the kind of country that had drawn settlers west for generations, promising space and freedom and the chance to build something lasting. The Double T Ranch Gate was an impressive structure of wrought iron and stone that spoke of serious money and careful planning. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she used William Thornton's keys to unlock the mechanism. Beyond the gate, a paved road wound through perfectly maintained pastures where cattle grazed beneath towering cottonwood trees. The main house appeared after a drive of nearly 10 minutes, and it took Sarah's breath away. The structure was a masterpiece of Western architecture, combining log construction with modern design elements that created something both rustic and elegant. Wide porches wrapped around the building on multiple levels, and large windows reflected the afternoon sunlight like mirrors. But it was the people gathered on the front porch who captured Sarah's attention and held it with an intensity that made her chest tighten with emotion. 7 adults, ranging in age from their early 20s to mid-30s, stood watching her approach with expressions that mixed curiosity, wariness, and something that might have been hope. Sarah parked her Honda beside a collection of pickup trucks and farm vehicles, feeling suddenly conscious of how out of place her small car looked in this setting of wealth and rural prosperity. She took a deep breath, gathered her courage, and stepped out to meet the people whose lives had just become her responsibility. James Thornton emerged from the house as she approached, his earlier anger replaced by something more complex. "These are my siblings," he said simply, "not by blood, but by choice. They have been my family for more than half my life." Sarah walked, slowly toward the porch, studying the faces of 7 people who represented one of the most unusual situations she had ever encountered. They were clearly Native American, with the kind of strong features and direct gazes that spoke of generations connected to this land. But there was something else in their expressions, a wariness that came from years of living outside normal social structures. A woman who appeared to be in her 30s stepped forward from the group. Her long black hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and she wore jeans and boots that showed the wear of real ranch work. Her eyes were intelligent and cautious as she extended her hand to Sarah. "I am Maria," she said in a voice that carried both strength and uncertainty. "William and Eleanor Thornton gave me that name when I was 8 years old. I do not remember what I was called before." The simple statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. These people did not even know their original names, their birth families, or their tribal connections. The Thorntons had tried to give them love and stability, but they had also erased fundamental parts of their identities in the process. Behind Maria, 6 other adults waited to be introduced. Sarah could see the family resemblance among some of them, suggesting that at least some were biological siblings who had been kept together. But she also saw the artificial nature of the group, people brought together by circumstance rather than blood. This was the secret that William Thornton had carried for decades. 7 children rescued from tragedy and raised in isolation, becoming adults who existed in the margins of society. The inheritance Sarah had received was not just land and money. It was the responsibility for human lives that had been shaped by decisions made with good intentions but questionable legality. As she stood on the porch of the most beautiful ranch she had ever seen, surrounded by people whose very existence challenged everything she thought she knew about family and identity, Sarah realized that accepting William Thornton's legacy would require courage she was not sure she possessed. But looking into the faces of 7 adults who had been denied the chance to make choices about their own lives, she knew she could not walk away. The first conversation Sarah had with Maria lasted 3 hours and left her feeling like she had stumbled into a parallel universe where normal rules of society simply did not exist. They sat in the ranch kitchen, a warm space filled with handmade furniture and the kind of lived-in comfort that spoke of decades of family meals and quiet conversations. Maria poured coffee from a pot that never seemed to empty and spoke in careful sentences about a life that defied every assumption Sarah had ever made about child welfare and family structure. "I remember the night William and Eleanor brought us here," Maria said, her fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug that bore the faded logo of the Double T Ranch. "I was 8 years old, and my youngest brother Carlos was only 3. We had been living in a group home in Billings after our parents died, and they kept saying we would be separated because families only wanted 1 or 2 children, not 7 siblings." Sarah made notes on a legal pad, trying to process information that would reshape her understanding of everything she thought she knew about the case. Maria spoke with the precision of someone who had told this story before, probably to James, when he was old enough to understand the implications of his parents' decision. "Eleanor came to the group home several times," Maria continued. "She would bring books and art supplies, and she would sit with us while we did our homework. She never made promises, but she asked questions about our family, our traditions, whether we remembered anything about our grandparents or our tribe." The tribal connection was something Sarah had been dreading to explore. 7 Native American children removed from the official system meant 7 people who had been denied their cultural birthright for over 2 decades. The Blackfeet Reservation, where Sarah worked, was home to thousands of people who struggled to maintain their cultural identity within the framework of modern American society. These 7 adults had grown up completely disconnected from that community. "Did Eleanor or William ever take you to visit the reservation?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Maria's expression grew sad. Eleanor tried to arrange visits with tribal elders, but it was complicated. We had no official documentation of our tribal membership, and William was afraid that bringing us to the reservation would attract attention from social services. So the elders came here instead. The image of tribal elders making secret visits to a private ranch to teach cultural traditions to hidden children would have been almost comical if the implications were not so serious. Sarah could imagine the delicate negotiations that must have taken place, the careful balance between respecting cultural heritage and maintaining the secrecy that protected the entire arrangement. Thomas Crowfeather was our primary teacher, Maria continued. He came every month for 15 years, until he passed away in 2013. He taught us about our history, our language, the traditional ways of our people. But he also helped us understand why we could not live on the reservation with our birth families. Sarah looked up from her notes. What do you mean by that? Maria was quiet for a long moment, staring out the kitchen window toward the mountains that formed the eastern boundary of the ranch property. Thomas told us that our parents had been struggling with addiction problems when they died. Our extended family was dealing with similar issues, and there were concerns about domestic violence and neglect. He said that William and Eleanor probably saved our lives by bringing us here. The complexity of the situation was beginning to overwhelm Sarah's ability to process it systematically. 7 children rescued from tragedy, raised with love and cultural awareness, but denied the legal identity and community connections that should have been their birthright. There were no clear heroes or villains in this story, only people making difficult choices with incomplete information and limited options. A younger man entered the kitchen as Maria finished speaking, his work boots leaving traces of mud on the spotless floor. He was perhaps 25 years old, with the kind of lean build that came from physical labor and outdoor living. His dark eyes assessed Sarah with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust strangers. "This is Carlos," Maria said, rising to embrace her youngest brother. "Carlos, this is Sarah Martinez, the woman I told you about." Carlos nodded politely but did not offer his hand. He moved to the coffee pot and poured himself a cup with the easy familiarity of someone who had been performing this routine for years. When he turned back to face Sarah, his expression was guarded, but not hostile. "Maria says you are here to decide what happens to us," he said without preamble. "She says William left you the ranch, and now you get to choose whether we stay or go." The blunt statement caught Sarah off guard. She had been thinking of her role in terms of legal advocacy and bureaucratic navigation, not as someone who would determine the future of 7 human lives. But Carlos was right. Whatever decision she made about the inheritance would directly affect people who had no legal standing to protect themselves. "Carlos, I am not here to make decisions about your life," Sarah said carefully. "I am here to understand the situation and help you explore your options. You are adults now, and you have the right to make your own choices about where you live and how you want to handle your legal status." Carlos laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Legal status? We do not have legal status. We exist in the spaces between official documents and government databases. We are ghosts who happen to be breathing." The bitterness in his voice spoke to years of frustration with a situation he had no power to change. Sarah recognized the tone from her work with teenagers who aged out of the foster care system, young people who found themselves adrift in a world that offered few support systems for those who did not fit standard categories. Maria placed a restraining hand on her brother's arm. "Carlos, Sarah is trying to help us. William trusted her enough to leave her everything. We should at least give her a chance to understand what we are dealing with." Before Carlos could respond, 2 more adults entered the kitchen through the back door. Sarah recognized them as siblings from their similar features and the way they moved together with unconscious coordination. The woman was perhaps 30 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. The man appeared slightly younger but carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions. Anna and Joseph, Maria said by way of introduction. They managed the cattle operation and the financial records for the ranch. Anna stepped forward and offered her hand with a firm grip that spoke of confidence and competence. Sarah, we have been expecting you. James told us about the will and what William wrote in his letter. Joseph remained silent, but his presence filled the kitchen with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested he was evaluating every word and gesture. Sarah had encountered similar personalities in her work with tribal council members, people who listened more than they spoke, but whose opinions carried significant weight when they finally chose to express them. We need to discuss the practical implications of this situation, Anna said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. William and Eleanor did their best to provide for us, but they could not solve all the problems that come with living outside the legal system. What kind of problems? Sarah asked, pulling out a fresh page on her legal pad. Anna exchanged glances with her siblings before answering. None of us have social security numbers, birth certificates, or any form of official identification. We cannot open bank accounts, apply for credit cards, or travel outside the country. We cannot vote in elections or serve on juries. We exist in the margins of society. The catalog of restrictions painted a picture of second-class citizenship that was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Sarah had worked with undocumented immigrants who faced similar challenges, but those individuals usually had some form of identification from their birth countries. These 7 people had been American citizens who were rendered stateless by a well-intentioned but legally questionable rescue. How do you handle financial matters? Sarah asked. How do you buy vehicles or handle medical expenses? Everything goes through the ranch accounts, Joseph said, speaking for the first time. William set up a system where the ranch employs us as workers, but our wages go into a collective fund that pays for our needs. It works for basic expenses, but it creates problems when we want to make independent financial decisions. Maria leaned forward across the table. Last year I wanted to buy a car so I could drive to Missoula to take college classes. But I could not get a loan or even register the vehicle in my name. James had to purchase it and list it as ranch equipment. The image of college-educated adults having to ask permission for basic purchases highlighted the infantilizing nature of their situation. William and Eleanor Thornton had tried to provide love and security, but they had also created a system of dependency that prevented their adopted children from achieving true independence. What about medical care? Sarah asked, thinking about the liability issues that would arise if any of the 7 adults faced serious health problems. Anna's expression grew dark. That is where the situation becomes really complicated. We have no insurance coverage that we can access independently. When Carlos broke his arm last year, James had to take him to the emergency room and claim he was a ranch employee injured on the job. The medical situation represented another layer of legal vulnerability that could expose the entire family to serious consequences. If any of the 7 adults required expensive treatment or long-term care, the financial burden would fall entirely on the ranch operation. More importantly, their lack of official identity could complicate their access to critical medical services. A door slammed somewhere in the house, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching the kitchen. James Thornton appeared in the doorway, his expression tense and his jaw set in the kind of rigid line that suggested he had been having difficult conversations. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "I just got off the phone with my lawyers, and the situation is more complicated than any of us realized." The adults around the kitchen table shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the tone that meant serious problems were developing. Sarah gathered her notes and followed James into a study that adjoined the main living area. The room was lined with bookshelves and dominated by a massive desk that had probably belonged to William Thornton. Family photographs covered every available surface, showing decades of holidays, birthdays, and casual moments that documented the growth of an unconventional, but clearly loving family. James closed the door and turned to face Sarah with an expression that mixed anger, fear, and desperation in equal measure. My lawyers just informed me that someone has been asking questions about the ranch and about unusual activity in this area. Apparently, a reporter from the Billings Gazette has been investigating stories about missing Native American children from the 1990s. Sarah felt her stomach drop as the implications became clear. A journalist investigating missing children would eventually connect the dots between the group home in Billings and the 7 adults living on the Double T Ranch. Once that connection became public, the legal consequences would be swift and severe. "What kind of questions?" she asked, though she was not sure she wanted to hear the answer. Questions about the group home that closed in 1998. Questions about families who lost contact with children in the state system. Questions about private adoption arrangements that bypassed official channels. James ran his hands through his hair in a gesture that reminded Sarah painfully of his father. "This reporter is not going to stop until she finds a story, and our family is going to be the biggest story she has ever written." The prospect of media attention would destroy any chance of resolving the situation quietly through legal channels. Once the story became public, federal authorities would be forced to investigate. Tribal councils would demand answers, and the 7 adults would become the center of a political firestorm they were not equipped to handle. "James, how long do you think we have before this reporter publishes her story?" Sarah asked, already beginning to formulate plans for damage control and legal protection. "My lawyers think we have maybe 2 weeks, possibly less if she finds someone willing to talk on the record. Once the story breaks, everything changes. The FBI will probably get involved because of the interstate transportation of minors. The tribal councils will demand jurisdiction over tribal members, and social services will want to investigate the entire arrangement." Sarah thought about the 7 adults in the kitchen, people who had spent their entire lives believing they were safe and protected on the ranch. The approaching media storm would shatter their world and force them to confront questions about identity and belonging that they were not prepared to answer. "James, we need to tell them what is happening," she said. "They have the right to know about the reporter and to make their own decisions about how to handle the situation." Before James could respond, a soft knock on the study door interrupted their conversation. Maria entered without waiting for permission, her face pale and her eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from overhearing conversations that confirm your worst suspicions. "We need to talk," she said simply. "All of us together about what happens next." The gathering that took place in the ranch living room an hour later was unlike any family meeting Sarah had ever witnessed. 7 adults who shared no blood, but 25 years of common experience sat in a rough circle while James paced near the windows and Sarah tried to find words that would explain the legal disaster they were all facing. The living room itself was a testament to the success of William and Eleanor's unconventional family experiment. The walls were covered with graduation photos, athletic trophies, and artistic creations that spanned 2.5 decades. These were not the artifacts of a dysfunctional or abusive household. They were the evidence of love, support, and genuine care extended to children who had needed a second chance at family. Maria had gathered her 6 siblings with the efficiency of someone accustomed to organizing group meetings. Carlos sat beside his sister, his earlier hostility replaced by nervous energy. Anna and Joseph flanked a woman Sarah had not yet met, a quiet person in her late 20s who watched the proceedings with intelligent eyes but had not yet spoken a word. The remaining 2 adults were clearly the youngest of the group, probably in their early 20s. The woman had the kind of delicate features that suggested she might have been the baby of the family when they arrived at the ranch. The man beside her carried himself with the confidence of someone who had been protected and encouraged throughout his development, but his eyes showed the first stirrings of adult worry about situations beyond his control. Sarah Maria said, once everyone had settled into their seats, please tell us exactly what is happening with this reporter and what it means for our family. Sarah looked around the circle of faces, seeing decades of trust and security about to be shattered by forces beyond anyone's control. These people deserved honesty, even if the truth would destroy the only life they had ever really known. A journalist is investigating missing Native American children from the 1990s. She began, choosing her words carefully. She has apparently connected your disappearance from the state system to unusual activity at this ranch. James's lawyers believe she will publish a story within the next 2 weeks. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken fears and the gradual realization that their protected existence was about to end. Carlos was the first to speak, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. So we are going to be exposed as freaks, victims, criminals, or all three, depending on how this reporter wants to tell our story. The woman Sarah had not yet met spoke for the first time, her voice soft but clear. My name is Rebecca, and I have been dreading this day for 10 years. Ever since I turned 18 and realized that I could not even get a library card in my own name. Her statement opened the floodgates for fears and frustrations that had been building for years. Anna talked about wanting to start her own business, but being unable to obtain the licenses and permits required for legal operation. Joseph described the humiliation of watching his friends vote in elections while he remained disenfranchised. The youngest woman, who introduced herself as Lisa, spoke about her dreams of becoming a teacher, but her inability to meet certification requirements without proper documentation. The catalog of restrictions and limitations painted a devastating picture of lives constrained by legal invisibility. These were intelligent, educated adults who had been denied the basic rights of citizenship because of decisions made when they were children. William and Eleanor Thornton had given them love and security, but they had also trapped them in a system that prevented them from achieving full independence. The youngest man, who said his name was David, finally voiced the question that everyone was thinking but no one wanted to ask. What happens to us when this story comes out? Do we get arrested? Do we get sent back to the reservation? Do we lose our home? Sarah looked around the circle of faces, seeing fear, anger, and a desperate need for honest answers. These people had been living in uncertainty for their entire adult lives, and they deserved to know the truth about their options, even if those options were limited and potentially painful. The legal consequences are complex, she said, trying to project more confidence than she felt. There could be investigations into the original adoption arrangements, questions about tax fraud and immigration violations, and demands from tribal authorities for jurisdiction over tribal members. But, she continued, you are adults now, and you have rights that cannot be taken away regardless of how you came to live here. You have the right to choose where you live, who you associate with, and how you want to handle your legal status going forward. James stopped pacing and turned to face the group. My lawyers are already working on strategies for damage control and legal protection. We can petition the courts for retroactive documentation, apply for recognition of your legal residence, and work with tribal authorities to establish your cultural connections. Maria leaned forward in her chair. James, what about the ranch? What happens to our home when all this becomes public? The question struck at the heart of the crisis. The Double T Ranch was not just property or inheritance. It was the only home these 7 people had ever really known, and the only place where they had been able to exist as a family unit. The approaching legal storm threatened to destroy not just their anonymity, but their fundamental sense of belonging and security. Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision that would reshape the entire trajectory of the situation. The ranch belongs to me now, according to your father's will. And I am making you a promise right here in front of everyone. Whatever happens, with the media attention and the legal investigations, This will remain your home for as long as you want to stay here." The words hung in the air like a sacred oath, and Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. She had just committed herself to protecting 7 people, whose very existence represented one of the most complex legal situations she had ever encountered. Rebecca wiped tears from her eyes and spoke in a voice thick with emotion. "Why would you do that for us? You did not know we existed a week ago, and now you are promising to risk everything to protect strangers." Sarah thought about her work on the reservation, the children she advocated for every day, the family she tried to keep together against bureaucratic odds. She thought about her own childhood, growing up with parents who taught her that some principles were worth any sacrifice. Because, she said simply, family is not just about blood relationships or legal documents. Family is about people who choose to protect and support each other, especially when the world becomes dangerous or uncertain. Your father understood that when he brought you here, and his wife understood it when she loved you as her own children. Carlos, who had been silent throughout most of the conversation, suddenly stood and walked to one of the windows overlooking the ranch property. Thousands of acres of grassland stretched toward the mountains, dotted with cattle and crossed by streams that sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. This was the only world he had ever really known, and the thought of losing it was clearly devastating. "Sarah," he said without turning around, "what if we choose to leave? What if we decide that staying here puts everyone at too much risk?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She had been thinking in terms of protecting the family unit and maintaining their connection to the ranch, but Carlos was raising the possibility that they might choose to separate and start new lives as individuals rather than as a group. "That would be your choice to make," she replied carefully. "But I want you to understand that leaving does not solve the legal problems. You would still need documentation and official identity regardless of where you choose to live." Joseph spoke, up from his position near the fireplace. "Carlos has a point, though. If we stay here, we become the center of a media circus that could last for years. Everyone who visits the ranch, everyone who does business with us, everyone who knows about our situation becomes part of the story." Anna nodded in agreement. "The ranch has been our sanctuary, but it could become our prison if we cannot move freely without attracting attention." The conversation continued for another hour as the 7 siblings wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. Should they fight to maintain their unconventional family structure, or should they accept separation as the price of legal recognition? Should they embrace their tribal heritage and seek connection with the reservation community, or should they focus on integration into mainstream American society? Sarah listened to the discussion with growing admiration for these remarkable people who had been forced to confront fundamental questions about identity and belonging without any guidance from the legal or social service systems that should have supported them. They were navigating uncharted territory with courage and intelligence, despite having been denied the tools that most people took for granted. As the sun began to set over the Montana landscape, casting long shadows across the ranch property, Sarah realized that she was witnessing the end of one chapter in an extraordinary story and the beginning of another that would test everyone involved in ways they could not yet imagine. The reporter's investigation would force them all into the spotlight, but it would also create opportunities for resolution that had not existed while they remained hidden. 7 adults who had lived as ghosts for most of their lives were about to become fully human in the eyes of the law, with all the rights and responsibilities that legal recognition would bring. The question that remained was whether they would face that transformation together, as the family William and Eleanor Thornton had created, or whether they would choose to walk different paths toward uncertain but independent futures. Sarah looked around the circle of faces, seeing determination, fear, love, and hope reflected in equal measure, and knew that whatever they decided, she would be there to help them navigate the challenges ahead. The phone call came at 4:30 in the morning, shattering the uneasy sleep Sarah had managed to find in the guest bedroom of the Double T Ranch. She fumbled for her cell phone in the darkness, her heart racing as she recognized the number of Thomas Henderson's law firm displaying on the screen. No lawyer called at dawn unless something catastrophic had happened. Miss Martinez, Henderson's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. You need to get to the ranch house immediately. There are federal agents at my office with search warrants, and they are demanding access to all documents related to the Thornton estate. Sarah sat up in bed, instantly alert despite the early hour. What kind of federal agents? What are they looking for? FBI and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They have warrants for documents related to potential human trafficking, child abduction, and immigration violations spanning the last 30 years. Henderson paused, and Sarah could hear papers rustling in the background. Miss Martinez, someone has provided them with very specific information about the 7 adults living on your property. The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. Someone had contacted federal authorities and provided enough detail to justify search warrants and what sounded like preparations for arrests. The quiet investigation they had hoped to manage privately had exploded into a federal case that would destroy any chance of protecting the family's privacy or controlling the narrative. Do you know who contacted the authorities? Sarah asked, though she suspected the answer would confirm her worst fears. Henderson's response was grim. The reporter from the Billings Gazette, Jennifer Walsh. She apparently decided that her story was too important to wait for publication. She contacted the FBI yesterday afternoon with allegations of organized child trafficking and cover-up, conspiracy involving prominent Montana families. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to process the implications. A journalist seeking to break a major story had essentially declared war on 7 innocent people whose only crime was surviving a childhood tragedy. The federal investigation would treat them as victims, perpetrators, or evidence, but not as human beings with the right to make their own choices about their futures. Henderson, how much time do we have before the agents arrive at the ranch? According to my sources, they are assembling a multi-agency task force that will serve warrants simultaneously at the ranch, at James Thornton's residence in Billings, and at several locations connected to the tribal council offices. I estimate you have maybe 2 hours before they arrive with enough personnel to secure the entire property. 2 hours to prepare 7 adults for the most traumatic experience of their lives. 2 hours to explain that the government they had never been able to officially join was about to treat them as evidence in a criminal investigation. 2 hours to help them understand that the family structure they had known for 25 years was about to be dismantled by people who viewed their existence as proof of wrongdoing. Sarah dressed quickly and made her way to the main house, where lights were already burning in the kitchen windows. She found James pacing in the living room while Maria and Carlos sat at the kitchen table with expressions that suggested they had been awake for hours. The family's early morning routine had been shattered by the same phone calls that had awakened Sarah. James looked up as she entered, his face haggard with exhaustion and fear. My lawyers just called. Federal agents are coming here with search warrants and arrest warrants. They think my parents were running some kind of child trafficking operation. The accusation was so far from the truth that it would have been absurd under different circumstances. William and Eleanor Thornton had rescued 7 children from a failing system and provided them with love, education, and stability. But viewed through the lens of federal law enforcement, their actions could easily be interpreted as kidnapping, human trafficking, and conspiracy to violate immigration statutes. Maria stood up from the kitchen table, her face pale but her voice steady. Sarah, we need to wake everyone and explain what is happening. If federal agents are coming here, we need to be prepared to protect ourselves and each other. The process of gathering the 7 adults and explaining the approaching crisis took almost an hour. Each person reacted differently to the news that their hidden existence had been exposed, and that federal authorities were treating their family as a criminal enterprise. Rebecca cried quietly while Anna paced the living room with barely controlled rage. Joseph sat in silence, his jaw clenched with the kind of fury that came from years of powerlessness suddenly being validated by outside forces. David, the youngest of the group, asked the question that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to voice. Are they going to arrest us? Are we going to be treated as criminals or as victims? Sarah looked around the room, 7 faces marked by fear, confusion, and the terrible realization that their protected world was about to be destroyed by forces beyond their control. These were adults who had been denied the most basic rights of citizenship, and now they were about to be thrust into a legal system that viewed them as either perpetrators or evidence rather than human beings with rights and dignity. The law enforcement response will probably treat you as victims initially, Sarah said, choosing her words carefully. But that designation comes with its own problems. Victim status in federal investigations often means protective custody, mandatory counseling, and limited freedom while authorities build their cases. Carlos laughed bitterly. So we go from being hidden by people who loved us to being hidden by people who see us as evidence. Either way, we lose our freedom to make our own choices. The assessment was painfully accurate. Federal victim protection protocols were designed to safeguard people who had been trafficked or abused, but they often resulted in restrictions that were nearly as limiting as the original victimization. The 7 adults would likely be separated for individual interviews, placed in temporary housing away from the ranch, and subjected to psychological evaluations that would determine their competency to make independent decisions. Lisa, who had been quiet throughout most of the conversation, suddenly spoke up with a question that cut to the heart of their dilemma. What if we refuse to cooperate? What if we tell them that we choose to stay here and that we do not want their protection? James, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the room with an expression of grim determination. That is exactly what you should do. You are adults, and you have the right to refuse federal protection if you believe it is not in your best interests. Sarah felt a chill of apprehension at the suggestion. Refusing to cooperate with federal investigators would likely result in obstruction charges and could be interpreted as evidence that the adults had been brainwashed or coerced by their captors. The legal system did not respond well to victims who refused to be rescued, especially in cases involving allegations of long-term manipulation and control. James, that could make the situation much worse, Sarah said. If they refuse to cooperate, the authorities might conclude that they have been psychologically damaged by years of isolation and manipulation. And if they do cooperate, James replied, they will be separated, institutionalized, and treated as damaged goods who need to be fixed by government experts who have never lived through anything remotely similar to their experiences. The debate was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching the ranch house. Through the large windows that faced the main driveway, Sarah could see a convoy of black SUVs and white vans making their way toward the house. The federal task force had arrived earlier than Henderson had predicted, and they had brought enough personnel to handle a major law enforcement operation. Maria moved to the window and counted the vehicles assembling in the ranch yard. At least 12 cars and trucks, she reported. Maybe 40 or 50 agents. They are treating this like a major criminal operation. The sight of armed federal agents surrounding their home was clearly devastating for people who had lived their entire adult lives, believing they were safe and protected on the ranch property. Sarah watched as 25 years of security and stability crumbled in the face of government authority that viewed their existence as evidence of criminal activity. A loud knock on the front door announced the beginning of the end of the only life the 7 adults had ever really known. James straightened his shoulders and walked toward the door with the dignity of someone who refused to be intimidated by circumstances beyond his control. Federal Bureau of Investigation, called a voice from outside. We have warrants to search these premises and to interview all residents. Please open the door and keep your hands visible. James opened the door to reveal a woman in her 40s wearing a dark suit and displaying the kind of professional authority that came with years of federal law enforcement experience. Behind her stood a team of agents equipped with everything from cameras to evidence collection kits. This was not a preliminary investigation. This was a full-scale operation designed to document and prosecute what they believed to be serious federal crimes. Agent Patricia Morrison, FBI, the woman announced, displaying her credentials. I have warrants to search these premises and to conduct interviews with all residents. We are investigating allegations of human trafficking, child abduction, and conspiracy to violate federal immigration statutes. James stepped aside to allow the agents to enter, but his posture remained defiant. Agent Morrison, these people are adults who have been living here voluntarily. They are not victims, and they are not being held against their will. Agent Morrison's expression remained professionally neutral as she surveyed the living room where the 7 adults stood in a tight group. Mr. Thornton, we will determine the voluntary nature of their residence through individual interviews, conducted away from potentially coercive influences. The phrase potentially coercive influences was clearly directed at James and Sarah, suggesting that the federal authorities viewed them as perpetrators or accomplices rather than advocates for the 7 adults. The investigation would be conducted under the assumption that anyone defending the family arrangement was part of a criminal conspiracy. Sarah stepped forward and identified herself as the legal owner of the ranch property. Agent Morrison, I am Sarah Martinez, and I inherited this property through William Thornton's will. These 7 individuals are living here as my invited guests, and they have the right to legal representation before submitting to any interviews. Agent Morrison's attention focused on Sarah with the intensity of someone who had found an unexpected complication in what should have been a straightforward victim rescue operation. Miss Martinez, we will need to interview you as well regarding your knowledge of the circumstances surrounding these individuals' residence on this property. Before Sarah could respond, Carlos stepped forward from the group of siblings with an expression of quiet determination. Agent Morrison, my name is Carlos, and I want you to understand something very clearly. My 6 siblings and I are not victims. We are adults who have chosen to live together as a family. We do not want or need rescue from people who have loved and supported us for 25 years. The statement clearly surprised Agent Morrison, who had probably expected to find traumatized victims grateful for federal intervention. Instead, she was confronting articulate adults who were rejecting the victim narrative that justified the entire law enforcement operation. Sir, Agent Morrison replied carefully, individuals who have been subjected to long-term manipulation and control often develop psychological attachments to their captors. We have trained professionals who can help you work through those feelings in a safe environment. Carlos's response was swift and angry. Agent Morrison, with respect, you have been investigating this situation for maybe a week. I have been living it for 25 years. I think I am better qualified to determine whether I am a victim or a willing participant in my own life. The exchange highlighted the fundamental disconnect between federal law enforcement protocols and the reality of the family's situation. The authorities were operating under the assumption that anyone living outside official systems must be a victim of criminal activity, while the 7 adults were asserting their right to self-determination and family autonomy. Maria joined her brother in facing Agent Morrison with a combination of dignity and defiance that spoke to years of quiet strength. Agent Morrison, we understand that you believe you are here to help us, but we are asking you to listen to what we are telling you about our own lives and our own choices. Agent Morrison's response reflected the inflexibility of federal procedures, designed to protect victims who might be too traumatized or manipulated to advocate for themselves. I appreciate your perspective, but our protocols require individual interviews in controlled environments to ensure that your statements are not influenced by ongoing coercion. The agents began separating the 7 adults despite their protests, preparing to conduct interviews that would treat their family bonds as evidence of psychological manipulation rather than genuine affection. Sarah watched in horror as 25 years of love and support was being dismantled by people who interpreted their unity as proof of criminal brainwashing. "Agent Morrison," Sarah said, trying to project legal authority she was not sure she possessed, "I am demanding that these interviews be conducted in the presence of legal counsel. These individuals have rights that must be protected regardless of your suspicions about their living arrangements." The federal agent's expression hardened as she realized that the operation was becoming more complicated than anticipated. "Miss Martinez, we have reason to believe that you may be involved in perpetuating the criminal conspiracy that brought these individuals to this location. Your demand for legal representation suggests consciousness of guilt." The accusation was both absurd and terrifying. Sarah had inherited the ranch and the responsibility for 7 lives less than a week earlier, but federal authorities were already constructing a narrative that portrayed her as part of a decades-long criminal enterprise. The investigation was moving beyond victim rescue into territory that could result in serious federal charges for everyone involved. James stepped forward with the kind of controlled anger that suggested he was reaching the limits of his patience with the federal intrusion. "Agent Morrison, you are in my family's home, accusing people I love of being either criminals or mental incompetents. These 7 people have college degrees, professional skills, and the intellectual capacity to make their own decisions about their lives. The education and competence of the 7 adults was clearly creating problems for federal assumptions about victimization and manipulation. Trafficking victims were supposed to be helpless and grateful for rescue, not articulate advocates for their own autonomy and family structure." Anna, who had been quiet throughout the confrontation, suddenly spoke with the kind of authority that came from years of managing complex ranch operations. "Agent Morrison, I have a degree in business administration from the University of Montana. I manage financial operations for a $12 million ranch. I am not a victim who needs to be rescued from my own family." Joseph joined his sister in challenging federal assumptions about their competence and autonomy. "I have a degree in agricultural engineering, and I have designed irrigation systems that are used on ranches throughout Montana. I am not a brainwashed victim who cannot make rational decisions about where I want to live." The catalog of educational achievements and professional competence was undermining the victim narrative that justified the federal investigation. Agent Morrison found herself confronting 7 articulate adults who refused to accept rescue from a life they had chosen and cherished. Rebecca, the quietest member of the group, surprised everyone by stepping forward with a question that cut to the heart of the legal and moral issues at stake. "Agent Morrison, if we were living in an apartment complex in Billings and working regular jobs, would you be here investigating our family relationships?" The question highlighted the arbitrary nature of federal intervention based on the location and circumstances of their residence rather than evidence of actual harm or coercion. The 7 adults were being treated as victims because they lived on a ranch outside normal bureaucratic oversight, not because they had been subjected to abuse or exploitation. Agent Morrison's response revealed the weakness of the federal case against the family arrangement. "The circumstances of your residence here suggest potential violations of federal statutes regarding human trafficking and child abduction. Our investigation is designed to determine whether crimes have been committed. But what if no crimes have been committed?" Carlos asked. "What if 7 children who lost their parents were given love and opportunities by people who refused to let them be separated by a bureaucratic system that treats siblings like inventory to be distributed?" The question forced Agent Morrison to confront the possibility that her Entire investigation was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the family's origin and development. The federal authorities had assumed criminal activity based on the unusual nature of the living arrangement, but they were discovering articulate adults who challenged every assumption about victimization and coercion. Sarah realized that the confrontation had reached a critical point, where the next few minutes would determine whether the 7 adults would be treated as autonomous individuals or as evidence in a federal prosecution. She made a decision that would either protect the family or expose her to serious criminal charges. "Agent Morrison," she said with as much authority as she could project, "I am invoking the constitutional rights of these 7 individuals to refuse federal protection and to remain in their chosen residence with legal counsel present for any further questioning." The invocation of constitutional rights in a federal investigation was a serious legal challenge that Agent Morrison could not ignore without risking procedural violations that would undermine any eventual prosecution. But it also escalated the confrontation from a victim rescue operation into a civil rights dispute that could attract media attention and political oversight. "Miss Martinez," Agent Morrison replied, "obstructing a federal investigation is a serious criminal offense that could result in charges against you and anyone who assists in that obstruction." The threat was clear and immediate. Sarah was being warned that protecting the 7 adults could result in her own prosecution for federal crimes. But looking around the room at people who had been denied basic rights for their entire adult lives, she found the courage to stand firm against federal authority that treated their existence as evidence of criminal activity. "Agent Morrison, these 7 individuals are asserting their constitutional rights to freedom of association, freedom of residence, and protection against unreasonable search and seizure. If you proceed without proper legal representation present, you will be violating their civil rights under federal law." The standoff that followed lasted nearly an hour as federal agents consulted with supervisors and prosecutors about how to proceed when supposed victims refused to be rescued and demanded constitutional protections. The situation had evolved beyond standard trafficking investigation protocols into uncharted legal territory where victim rights conflicted with law enforcement procedures. During the tense waiting period, the 7 adults demonstrated the kind of unity and mutual support that characterize genuine family relationships rather than coercive manipulation. They consulted with each other, shared concerns and fears, and ultimately made collective decisions about how to protect their rights while cooperating with legitimate investigative needs. The resolution came when Agent Morrison received instructions from federal prosecutors who recognized the legal complications created by articulate adults refusing victim status. The interviews would proceed, but they would be conducted on the ranch property with legal counsel present, and with the understanding that the adults were cooperating voluntarily rather than being compelled to participate in their own rescue. Agent Morrison announced the compromise with obvious frustration at the delays and complications that had disrupted what should have been a straightforward law enforcement operation. "We will conduct preliminary interviews here on the property with legal counsel present. However, this investigation will continue, and we reserve the right to pursue federal charges against anyone who has violated laws regarding child welfare and immigration." The threat of future prosecution hung over everyone like a storm cloud, but the immediate crisis had been resolved in favor of the family's right to remain together while the legal issues were sorted out through proper channels. The 7 adults had successfully asserted their autonomy and refused to be treated as helpless victims, but they had also attracted federal attention that would continue to threaten their privacy and security. Sarah looked around the room at 7 people who had just fought the most important battle of their lives and won a temporary victory that might cost them everything they had spent 25 years building together. The federal investigation would continue, media attention would intensify, and legal challenges would multiply. but they had established their right to be heard as autonomous individuals rather than voiceless victims. The fight for their freedom and dignity was just beginning, but they had proven that love and unity could stand against federal authority when fundamental rights were at stake. The ranch that had been their sanctuary was about to become a battlefield, but they would face whatever came next as a family determined to protect each other and the life they had chosen together. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source 3 weeks after the federal agents had withdrawn to conduct their investigation through proper legal channels. Dr. Elizabeth Crow Dog, a tribal elder and professor of Native American Studies at the University of Montana, arrived at the Double T Ranch in a dusty pickup truck accompanied by 2 younger women, who carried themselves with the quiet dignity of people accustomed to navigating complex bureaucratic situations. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as the 3 women approached the house, noting the careful way they observed the ranch buildings and the respectful distance they maintained from the main entrance until someone came out to greet them. This was not a casual visit or an attempt to exploit the family situation for personal gain. These were people who understood cultural protocols and the importance of proper introductions in sensitive circumstances. Maria opened the front door and stepped onto the porch with the kind of cautious hospitality that had become necessary since their ranch had attracted federal attention. The 7 adults had learned to be wary of unexpected visitors who might be journalists, federal agents, or curiosity seekers drawn by media coverage of their unusual situation. Dr. Crow Dog approached with her hands visible and her expression open, speaking in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to mediating between different communities and conflicting interests. I am Dr. Elizabeth Crow Dog from the Blackfeet Nation, and I have come to speak with the 7 adults who have been living on this ranch. I bring greetings from the Tribal Council and an offer of assistance with the legal and cultural challenges you are facing. The introduction was formal but warm, establishing Dr. Crow Dog's credentials while making it clear that she was not there to judge or exploit the family situation. Sarah joined Maria on the porch, recognizing the significance of an official tribal representative choosing to visit the ranch during such a complicated legal situation. Dr. Crow Dog, I am Sarah Martinez, the current owner of this property. These 7 individuals are my guests, and I want to ensure that any discussions respect their autonomy and their right to make their own decisions about tribal connections. Dr. Crow Dog smiled with genuine warmth, clearly appreciating Sarah's protective stance toward the 7 adults. Miss Martinez, the Tribal Council has been following the federal investigation with great interest. We understand that these 7 people were children when they came to live here, and we want to offer support that honors both their cultural heritage and their chosen family structure. The offer of tribal support was potentially transformative for the legal situation. If the Blackfeet Nation was willing to recognize the 7 adults as tribal members and advocate for their rights, it would provide them with powerful allies who understood both the legal complexities and the cultural sensitivities involved in their case. Carlos emerged from the house followed by his 6 siblings, their expressions mixing curiosity with wariness as they evaluated these unexpected visitors. The years of isolation from tribal communities had left them uncertain about how they would be received by people who might view their upbringing as a betrayal of their cultural heritage. Dr. Crow Dog studied the 7 faces before her with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was seeing beyond their current circumstances to their deeper connections and possibilities. These women with me are Jennifer Crow Feather, granddaughter of Thomas Crow Feather, who taught you about our traditions, and Dr. Sarah Running Bear, who specializes in helping Native American families navigate federal bureaucracy. The mention of Thomas Crow Feather created an immediate connection between the visitors and the 7 adults who had treasured their monthly lessons with the tribal elder. Jennifer Crow Feather stepped forward with tears in her eyes, clearly moved by the 5. Opportunity to meet people who had known and learned from her grandfather. My grandfather spoke often about the 7 children who lived with the white family, but who kept their hearts connected to our people, Jennifer said in a voice thick with emotion. He said you were some of his best students, eager to learn and respectful of the old ways, even though you could not live among us. The validation from Thomas Crow Feather's granddaughter was profoundly meaningful for 7 people who had always wondered whether their cultural education had been authentic or adequate. They had learned traditional stories, language, and customs from a respected elder, but they had never been certain whether their isolation from the broader tribal community had compromised their connection to their heritage. Rebecca, who had been the most hesitant to trust outsiders, stepped forward with a question that revealed years of uncertainty about her identity and belonging. Miss Crow Feather, do you think we are still truly Native American after living apart from our people for so many years? The question struck at the heart of complex issues surrounding cultural identity and authenticity that had no easy answers. Dr. Crow Dog responded with the wisdom of someone who had spent decades helping people navigate similar questions about belonging and connection. Being Native American is not something that can be taken away by circumstances beyond your control, she said gently. Your blood carries the DNA of our ancestors. Your hearts carry the teachings that Thomas Crow Feather shared with you, and your spirits carry the connection to this land that has sustained our people for thousands of years. Anna asked the practical question that would determine whether tribal support could actually help their legal situation. Dr. Crow Dog, would the Tribal Council be willing to help us establish our legal status and our rights as tribal members? Dr. Running Bear stepped forward to address the legal and bureaucratic aspects of their situation. The Tribal Council has authorized me to begin the process of documenting your tribal membership and helping you navigate the federal systems that can provide you with official identity documents. This process will take time, but it will give you legal standing that the federal investigators cannot ignore. The prospect of official recognition and legal protection through tribal membership was exactly what the 7 adults needed to escape the legal limbo that had defined their entire adult lives. But it also raised questions about whether they would be expected to choose between their ranch family and their tribal connections. Joseph voiced the concern that was troubling all of them. Dr. Running Bear, if we pursue tribal membership and legal recognition, does that mean we would be expected to leave the ranch and live on the reservation? Dr. Crow Dog's response reflected the modern reality of Native American identity that encompassed multiple ways of honoring cultural heritage while living in contemporary American society. Many tribal members live and work throughout Montana and beyond while maintaining their connections to tribal communities and traditions. Your residence here does not compromise your tribal identity or your right to participate in tribal governance. The conversation continued for several hours as the 3 tribal representatives explained the process of documenting tribal membership, applying for federal recognition of their legal status, and navigating the bureaucratic systems that could provide them with social security numbers, birth certificates, and other forms of official documentation. Dr. Running Bear outlined the steps required to establish their legal identity through tribal channels. First, we will document your family connections and establish your enrollment in tribal records. Then we will work with federal agencies to obtain recognition of your legal status as tribal members who were living in private placement due to family tragedy. The phrase private placement was carefully chosen to reframe the family situation in terms that federal authorities could understand and accept, rather than illegal adoption or potential trafficking. The 7 adults would be documented as tribal members who had been placed with a non-native family during a childhood crisis, and who had maintained their cultural connections through approved tribal education programs. Sarah listened to the discussion with growing hope that the legal crisis might be resolved through tribal advocacy and federal recognition of the family's legitimate existence. But she also recognized that success would depend on the willingness of federal authorities to accept tribal jurisdiction over tribal members and to acknowledge that the 7 adults were competent to make their own decisions about their living arrangements. James, who had been listening from the doorway, joined the conversation with questions about how tribal support might affect the federal investigation that was still ongoing. Dr. Crowdog, what happens if federal prosecutors decide to pursue criminal charges against my family for the original placement of these 7 children? Dr. Crowdog's expression grew serious as she addressed the possibility of continued federal prosecution. The Tribal Council has retained attorneys who specialize in federal Indian law and civil rights cases. If federal prosecutors attempt to criminalize what was essentially a private tribal family placement during a crisis, we will challenge their jurisdiction and their interpretation of the relevant statutes. The prospect of tribal legal support was encouraging, but Sarah knew that federal prosecutors were reluctant to back down from high-profile cases that had attracted media attention. The investigation had been launched based on allegations of human trafficking and child abduction, and prosecutors would face political pressure to pursue charges, even if the evidence did not support the original accusations. Dr. Running Bear addressed the media and public relations aspects of the situation that could influence federal decision-making. The Tribal Council is prepared to issue public statements supporting the 7 adults and explaining the cultural and legal context of their family situation. We have relationships with journalists who understand Native American issues and who can help tell this story accurately. The offer of media support was crucial because public perception would influence both federal prosecution decisions and political pressure from tribal and civil rights organizations. If the story could be reframed from potential trafficking to successful cultural preservation, it would be much harder for federal authorities to justify continued persecution of the family. Lisa asked about the timeline for resolving the legal issues and establishing their official status. Dr. Running Bear, how long will it take to get the documentation we need to function as legal citizens? The process of obtaining federal recognition of tribal membership and legal status typically takes 6 to 12 months, Dr. Running Bear explained. However, we can begin immediately with tribal enrollment and emergency documentation that will provide you with some legal protections while the full process is completed. The timeline was longer than anyone had hoped, but it represented a clear path toward resolution of the legal limbo that had constrained the 7 adults throughout their lives. More importantly, it provided them with advocates who understood both the cultural and legal aspects of their situation. David raised a concern that had been troubling the younger members of the group. What if some of us want to explore life on the reservation while others prefer to stay here on the ranch? Will we be forced to choose between tribal identity and family unity? Dr. Crowdog's response reflected the flexibility and understanding that characterized modern tribal approaches to family and community structure. Tribal membership does not require reservation residence, and family bonds are not limited by geography. Some of you may choose to spend time on the reservation learning about contemporary tribal life, while others may prefer to maintain your primary residence here while participating in tribal activities and governance. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar black SUV that announced the return of federal agents to the ranch property. Agent Morrison emerged from the vehicle accompanied by 2 men in expensive suits who carried themselves with the authority of federal prosecutors, preparing to announce important decisions. Dr. Crowdog observed the approaching federal officials with the calm alertness of someone who had dealt with government authorities throughout her career. Miss Martinez, I suggest that we include tribal representatives in whatever conversation these federal officials want to have with the 7 adults. Sarah agreed immediately, recognizing that tribal advocacy could provide legal protections that she could not offer as an individual ranch owner. Agent Morrison, Dr. Crowdog represents the Tribal Council. and is here to advocate for the rights of tribal members who are residents on my property." Agent Morrison's expression suggested that tribal involvement was an unwelcome complication in what federal authorities had hoped would be a straightforward victim rescue operation. "Dr. Crowdog, we appreciate tribal interest in this case, but our investigation concerns potential federal crimes that supersede tribal jurisdiction." Dr. Crowdog's response was polite but firm, reflecting decades of experience in asserting tribal sovereignty against federal overreach. "Agent Morrison, these 7 individuals are tribal members who were placed in private care during a family emergency. Their placement and upbringing fall under tribal jurisdiction, and any federal prosecution would need to respect tribal sovereignty and the rights of tribal members." The assertion of tribal jurisdiction created immediate legal complications for federal prosecutors who had built their case on the assumption that the 7 adults were victims of non-tribal criminals who had violated federal statutes. If the placement had been a legitimate tribal family arrangement, the foundation of the federal case would collapse. One of the federal prosecutors stepped forward to address the tribal jurisdiction issue. "Dr. Crowdog, federal authorities have responsibility for investigating crimes involving the interstate transportation of minors and violations of federal child welfare statutes." Dr. Running Bear responded with the kind of legal precision that suggested extensive preparation for this confrontation. Under the Indian Child Welfare Act, tribal authorities have jurisdiction over the placement and welfare of tribal children. The federal investigation appears to have proceeded without consulting tribal authorities or recognizing tribal sovereignty over tribal members. The mention of the Indian Child Welfare Act was a legal bombshell that undermined the entire foundation of the federal investigation. The act specifically protected tribal children from removal by non-tribal authorities and required tribal involvement in any decisions about their placement or welfare. Federal prosecutors had apparently ignored these protections in their rush to build a trafficking case. Agent Morrison attempted to maintain federal authority despite the obvious legal complications. The Indian Child Welfare Act does not provide immunity for individuals who violate federal criminal statutes regarding human trafficking and child abduction. Dr. Crowdog's response was swift and decisive. "Agent Morrison, no federal criminal statutes were violated. 7 tribal children who lost their parents were placed with a non-tribal family in consultation with tribal elders and with ongoing tribal supervision of their cultural education. This arrangement was consistent with both tribal traditions and federal Indian law. The reframing of the family's origin story as a legitimate tribal placement supervised by tribal authorities completely undermined the federal trafficking investigation." Sarah watched as federal prosecutors realized that their high-profile case was collapsing under the weight of tribal sovereignty and civil rights protections they had failed to consider. Carlos stepped forward to address Agent Morrison directly. "Agent Morrison, we have tried to tell you that we are not victims and that we do not need or want federal rescue from our chosen family. Now our tribal representatives are explaining the legal and cultural context that you ignored when you launched this investigation. The 7 adults had found their voices and their advocates, and they were no longer vulnerable to federal assumptions about victimization and coercion. With tribal support and legal representation, they could assert their rights as both American citizens and tribal members who had the authority to make their own decisions about their lives and relationships." The federal prosecutor, who had remained silent during the earlier exchanges, finally spoke with obvious frustration at the legal complications that had emerged. "Dr. Crowdog, federal authorities will need to review tribal documentation and consult with our specialists in federal Indian law before making final decisions about this investigation." Dr. Crowdog nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully defended tribal sovereignty against federal overreach. "We welcome federal review of our documentation and legal analysis. We are confident that your specialists will confirm that no federal crimes were committed and that this investigation should be closed. Agent Morrison and the federal prosecutors departed with the obvious reluctance of law enforcement officials who had invested significant resources in an investigation that was collapsing under legal and political pressure. The tribal intervention had provided the 7 adults with protections that federal authorities could not ignore without risking challenges to their jurisdiction and authority. After the federal officials left, Dr. Crow Dog gathered the 7 adults and their advocates for a discussion about the next steps in establishing their legal status and protecting their rights. The Tribal Council will begin immediately with documentation of your tribal enrollment and emergency identity verification. We will also coordinate with federal agencies to ensure that this investigation is closed without prejudice to your rights or your family relationships. Sarah felt a profound sense of relief as she realized that the legal crisis that had threatened to destroy the family was being resolved through tribal advocacy and federal recognition of tribal sovereignty. The 7 adults would finally receive the legal recognition they had been denied throughout their lives, while maintaining their chosen family structure and their connection to the ranch they considered home. Maria spoke for all 7 siblings. When she thanked Dr. Crow Dog and her colleagues for their advocacy and support, "Dr. Crow Dog, you have given us something we never dared to hope for. Legal recognition of who we are and the right to make our own choices about our futures." Dr. Crow Dog's response reflected the satisfaction of someone who had helped restore justice and dignity to people who had been denied both for too long. "You have always been tribal members and American citizens. We have simply helped you claim the recognition that was rightfully yours from the beginning." As the tribal representatives prepared to leave with promises to return within days with documentation and legal support, Sarah looked around at 7 people who had finally found their voices, their advocates, and their legal standing after 25 years of uncertainty and fear. The ranch that had been their sanctuary would remain their home, but now they would have the freedom to explore connections and opportunities that had been denied to them throughout their adult lives. The fight for their recognition and rights had been won through the courage to assert their autonomy and the wisdom of tribal advocates who understood both the legal complexities and the cultural sensitivities involved in their unique situation. They had proven that family bonds forged through love and mutual support could withstand both federal investigation and bureaucratic indifference when defended by people who understood the true meaning of justice and human dignity. 18 months after the federal investigation closed, Sarah stood on the front porch of the Double T Ranch, watching 7 people who had transformed from hidden survivors into recognized leaders in their community. The morning sun illuminated a property that now served as both a working ranch and an educational center where tribal youth learned traditional ranching skills alongside cultural heritage programs. Maria had established the first Native American agricultural scholarship program in Montana, using her business expertise to create opportunities for tribal students who wanted to blend traditional land management with modern farming techniques. Her office in the renovated barn displayed certificates from 3 universities, where she now served as a guest lecturer on sustainable ranching practices. Carlos had become a certified social worker specializing in tribal family services, helping other families navigate the complex systems that had once denied him basic recognition. His approach combined professional training with personal experience, creating trust with families who had learned to be wary of government intervention. Anna and Joseph had expanded the ranch operations into a cooperative model that employed dozens of tribal members, while maintaining the environmental stewardship principles that William Thornton had established decades earlier. Their innovation in sustainable cattle ranching had attracted attention from agricultural colleges across the western states. Rebecca had fulfilled her childhood dream of becoming a teacher, establishing a 1-room schoolhouse that served children from 5 surrounding ranches. Her curriculum integrated traditional tribal education with state academic standards, creating a model that other rural communities had begun to adopt. Lisa had opened a veterinary practice that served both ranch animals and the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center she had founded in partnership with the Tribal Natural Resources Department. Her work combined modern veterinary medicine with traditional knowledge about animal healing that tribal elders had shared with her. David had become a tribal liaison officer, helping coordinate between federal agencies and tribal governments on issues ranging from land management to educational funding. His diplomatic skills and cultural knowledge made him invaluable in resolving conflicts that might otherwise have escalated into legal battles. James remained on the ranch as operations manager, but his relationship with his 7 siblings had evolved into something deeper than shared residence. They had become true family, bound not by obligation or legal requirement, but by choice and mutual respect. His children, born the previous year, were being raised with awareness of both their European American heritage and the tribal traditions that enriched their extended family. Sarah had used her inheritance to establish the Thornton Foundation for Family Preservation, a nonprofit organization that helped other families navigate bureaucratic challenges while maintaining their unity and cultural connections. The foundation had assisted over 200 families in resolving legal status issues without sacrificing their chosen family structures. The ranch had become a destination for families facing similar challenges to those that had once threatened the 7 adults. The guest program provided temporary residence for people working through legal documentation processes, while learning from others who had successfully navigated similar obstacles. Dr. Crow Dog visited regularly to conduct traditional ceremonies and cultural education programs that connected the ranch residents with broader tribal communities throughout the region. The monthly gatherings had grown into intertribal events that strengthened relationships between different Native American nations, while honoring the diverse traditions represented in the extended ranch family. The media attention that had once threatened their privacy had transformed into positive recognition for their innovative approaches to family preservation and cultural education. Documentary filmmakers had chronicled their story as an example of how love and determination could overcome systemic barriers to create lasting positive change. Federal authorities had officially closed their investigation with a public statement acknowledging that no crimes had been committed and recognizing the legitimate nature of the tribal family placement that had saved 7 children from institutional separation. The statement had become a precedent for other cases involving cultural preservation and family autonomy. As Sarah prepared to leave for a speaking engagement at a national conference on Native American family services, she reflected on how completely her life had changed since that morning in Thomas Henderson's office when she had learned about her unexpected inheritance. The ranch had given her far more than financial security. It had provided her with a purpose that connected her professional expertise with her personal values. The 7 adults had achieved everything they had been denied throughout their early lives: legal recognition, educational opportunities, professional success, and most importantly, the freedom to choose their own paths while maintaining their family bonds. Their transformation from hidden survivors to community leaders demonstrated the potential that could be unleashed when systemic barriers were removed and human dignity was respected. The ranch continued to thrive as both a successful business operation and a symbol of how different communities could work together to create solutions that honored both cultural heritage and contemporary needs. The partnership between tribal sovereignty and private property rights had created a model that other regions were beginning to study and adapt. William Thornton's legacy had evolved far beyond his original vision of providing sanctuary for 7 children. His ranch had become a catalyst for systemic change that protected family unity while respecting cultural diversity and individual autonomy. The secret he had carried for decades had become a beacon of hope for families everywhere who refused to accept that love and law had to be in conflict. The afternoon breeze carried the sounds of children learning traditional songs from tribal elders, while modern agricultural equipment harvested crops that would feed both ranch cattle and reservation communities. This was the inheritance that truly mattered, a living demonstration that family could transcend blood, law, and convention when guided by love, respect, and unwavering commitment to human dignity. Up next, you have got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you will not want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.